talking about today and the time that we have comes up and maybe prompts a question from you, feel free. If there's a question that's maybe slightly off topic, we might take a look at it and see if it's something that we can get answered. But if not, we're going to try to defer maybe to the questions that seem most relevant and kind of on point for the discussion here on philosophy of mind. Um, just to give you guys a little bit of background on how I learned about Professor Wilson here. I read a whole bunch of her papers for my philosophy of mind class, and I felt like I couldn't really argue against anything that he was saying. So I was very
That's
impressed.
awesome.
I had a very difficult time finding problems, and I felt like a lot of the stuff was really intuitive to me. And if we're going to start doing Q and A's here, why not bring on a very powerful philosophical mind? So that's enough of my fangirling. Um,
Thank you all.
uh, yeah, anytime. Um, so I guess first off, just to kind of get this started, when we were reviewing some of your work, planning this Q&A, we saw that you've written on a couple different topics. One of them was religion. Of course, you've written on mind. You've written on, kind of the associated metaphysics around it. Um, why philosophy of mind? Like, what piqued your interest about that? And how did you get that start there?
Well, I think I was mainly motivated initially by my interest in the natural sciences and how they might be or might not be related to more fundamental sciences and ultimately fundamental physics. So it's kind of a generalization of the mind body problem, where you wonder, well, looks like mental states, in some sense, somehow or another, depend on physical states, brain states, and more fundamental states, and yet they seem to have a certain kind of autonomy. Um, uh, and we certainly hope, as creatures with minds, that we have, say, a just kind of distinctive efficacy and so on. So really, my interest, even going back to my undergraduate career when I was studying physics and math, was really in natural reality, how things fit together, how minds depend on brains, and so on. But more generally, how do biological goings on depend on chemical goings on, and so on and so forth. And this was the uh, the topic of my dissertation at Cornell, was to sort of consider, what options somebody who thought that all broadly scientific entities and features uh, completely metaphysically depended on lower level physical goings on, massively complex lower level physical goings on. What were the options for making sense of that view, as well as its best naturalistically acceptable competitors, which I uh, typically take to be something that goes under the rubric of strong emergence or strong emergentism, according to
Mhm.
which for example, mental goings on, qualitative mental states, and so on, again, in some sense, depend on brain states and lower level physical states. And yet they themselves, according to this strong emergentist anti-physicalist view, are themselves, in some sense, fundamental. So I was really interested in the varieties of physicalism, and there are many varieties, as well as physicalism's best competitors. But like with mentality being the case that seems trickiest insofar as you might think, well, the chemical goings on, we're happy to allow that they're nothing over and above the physical goings on in some sense, or, properties of water or other kinds of chemical substances, things like hearts and so on. We don't need to posit any new fundamental powers or interactions to make sense of those, even if we don't, can't write down the equation
Mhm.
uh, for the existence or features of those goings on in physical, fundamental physical terms. We still think there's kind of like an explanatory and metaphysical connection there that's pretty straight, apparent or at least fairly uncontroversial. But with mentality, we have the distinctive features of, qualitativity, the experiences of pain or seeing red, intentionality, where your mind can represent things that may not exist, and of course, one that one feature of mentality that I think is especially important for understanding ourselves as, agents, human creatures operating in the world is free will. So that, in a way, I think, motivated the attention to the metaphysics of mind in particular as being a kind of crucial test case for these different positions.
Yeah, and that's then I think you're right to point to like all of there's all of this stuff going on, and I think on that note, I think the next questions are going to be questions about this kind of concept of grounding, this concept of goings on, because
Mhm.
it seems like you've alleged, um, maybe more than alleged, you kind of became a thorn in the side of everybody at Rutgers. um,
Yeah.
right, you
The
swung at this.
groundhogs.
Yes, you swung at you swung at the groundhogs. And I wanted to kind of talk like if you could maybe um do I guess like on Reddit they call it like an explain like I'm five, right?
Yeah, sure.
What's going on with grounding? Like what is grounding trying to do? What does it mean? How do we fix it?
Yeah, good. Well, just as a, kind of an autobiographical note, when I was, say, so this is going back about 20 years ago when I got my, you know, defended my thesis in 2002. Um, you know, in trying to formulate these views, such as physicalism as the thesis that, all the broadly scientific goings on, in some sense, are nothing over and above or realized in or completely metaphysically dependent on the lower level physical goings on, um, there were a number of different suggestions as regards what precisely the relation is supposed to be between the seemingly higher level entities and properties of the sort that are treated by the special sciences and the complex aggregates of lower level goings on. Like, so for example, here's this table, it has a certain shape, circular shape in my case. And, we think, well, what exactly is the relation between the shape of the table at the macro level and uh, the boundaries of the complex aggregate of molecules, atoms, whatever the fundamental physical goings on might be, what exactly is that relation? And many different relations were on offer as far back as 20 and even 30 years ago. One of them is just identity, according to which the physicist will say, well, I think the shape of the table is just identical to some lower level physical property of the aggregate. Non-reductive physicalists, so-called, also we might call them weak emergentists. They will say, actually, for example, the shape of the table is not identical to any lower level physical property, but it's realized in the lower level property. For example, maybe there's a functional role associated with maybe not shape, but some other property like solidity, and then there's lower level physical properties that sort of implement that functional role. And you see this also in the case of mentality, where the idea is that you know having a belief is associated with a certain causal role, and then different lower level physical goings on could play that role. So this is the source of so-called multiple realizability, right? And among other suggestions for the relation at issue, besides identity and functional realization, there was also put on the table a kind of modal correlational notion called supervenience, where if somebody doesn't want to get their metaphysical hands dirty, they can just say, Well, I don't know, whatever this exact relation is, I don't know. But for physicalist purposes, it suffices if the correlation between the higher level feature and the lower level physical feature is sufficiently strong, holds in every possible world where, you've got the one, you get the other, or some kind of correlation like that. I don't think that actually is modal correlations are strong enough to get what the physicalist wants, but anyway, that was another option on the table. Another option on the table was had the determinable determinant relation. So Stephen Yablo at MIT suggested this back in '92. That maybe mental states in particular stand to their physical realizers in something like the relation of that red stands to its specific shades like scarlet. So the physical goings on are like more specific, and the mental goings on are kind of like abstractions in the same way that red is sort of, you know, uh, it, it's a specific way of sorry, scarlet is a specific way of being red, right? And
Mm.
so whenever you have red, you've got some kind of determinate scarlet, and if you have that determinate scarlet or some determinate shade, scarlet or crimson or whatever, and whenever you have one of those shades, then you end up with something that's red. And so Yablo was like, oh, determinable determinate relation. That's what that's called. Um, that serves as a good model for the relation between mental and physical properties of, a relation in particular that shows that mental properties could be physically acceptable, right? In the same way that red is literally completely metaphysically dependent on a given occasion on its, whatever specific shade of red is, co-instantiated with it. Similarly, you can make sense of a mental states as being nothing over and above physical states if mental states are determinables of physical states. So all this is just to say that, 20, 30 years ago, there was already had been an enormous amount of work and articulation, especially in the metaphysics of mind and metaphysics of science literatures that was, you know, looking closely at this question: how should we understand specifically metaphysical dependence? Now, people used the term grounding back then, but when they used this expression grounding, they were using it in a schematic way to mean some or other specific metaphysical dependence relation. Maybe identity, type or token, maybe functional realization, maybe the determinable determinant relation, and so on. And there's an enormous amount of literature on all these specific relations and whether they are, better or worse so far as accommodating, for example, the, you know, metaphysical dependence of mental states on physical states and so on. But then back in, you know, uh, the 2000s, around that time, there were several prominent philosophers who said, look, we need metaphysical dependence. We're, qua metaphysicians, we should not be only attending to what exists, but we should be paying attention to what depends on what. And conceptual entailment won't work, causation won't work. Those are not the right, they don't have the right features. Those are, um, you know, conceptual entail. Often we just don't have the requisite conceptual entailments. Causation is a completely different relation. And supervenience, understood as that more modal correlational notion, that doesn't work. A lot of people agreed with them about that. But then they said this next thing, which was okay, so let's posit a primitive notion of metaphysical dependence and we'll call it grounding. So they kind of appropriated this expression grounding, which used to be used in a schematic way to refer to some or other, specific, uh, metaphysical dependence relation.
Mhm.
And they said, oh, okay, let's posit a primitive generic notion of metaphysical dependence. We'll call it grounding. And the supposition is that it's operative in any case where there is metaphysical dependence, whether I'm talking about the shape of the table or mental states on brain states or, ecosystems, on underlying biological and botanical phenomena, and so on. In all those cases, there's this primitive generic notion of metaphysical dependence grounding. So, and moreover, we're going to stipulate that it has these formal features and so on. So my, when I became aware that people were forwarding this idea, I was like, look, um, that argument for a primitive generic is enthymematic because it ignores all this enormous amount of literature on the specific metaphysical dependence relations. Yeah, conceptual entailment, causation, and supervenience are not sufficient unto the task of making sense of metaphysical dependence in these various contexts. For example, when I'm trying to figure out, how best to characterize physicalism, something like that. But
Mhm.
that doesn't mean we should quickly jump to the posit of a generic primitive, because there's all these other relations which are substantive metaphysical dependence relations that give you a lot of information about the nature of the dependence that's at issue in different cases and so on. So, um, I guess if somebody wants to say, what's the, you know, what is grounding, I want to say there's two conceptions of grounding out there, at least two, right?
Mhm.
One of them is just it's like a schematic term that is just used to say, well, I'm not getting specific about which dependence relation is at issue, it's some or other. So I might say physicalism is the thesis that everything is grounded in the physical, not intending to say that there's some one relation that's operative in every case, but rather to say that, for any given special science entity or feature, somehow or another, it completely metaphysically depends on the physical goings on. Maybe it's identity in one case, maybe it's realization in another, and so on. That's one kind of use of the word grounding to talk about metaphysical dependence, and I'm perfectly happy with that use. Then the other use is one which I feel like was, introduced in a kind of, enthymematic way, which is to say, argumentatively unsupported way, according to which, there's it's very heavily loaded, primitive, generic notion of metaphysical dependence supposed to be operative in every case. And I think that notion has not yet been, uh, off. We haven't seen really any good reason to think there is any such, notion of metaphysical dependence, or that we need such a notion of metaphysical dependence in order to do metaphysics.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
So, so I'm going to move into those are just some of my questions, and some of my questions got repeated by the crowd. So we'll move into them, and I have a few selected here. So, first off, uh, I'd like to go with Ben's question. And Ben asks, is consciousness just a computation in your honest opinion, or is it emergent of something else?
Yeah, thank you, Ben. So I have a whole chapter on this very question in a book of mine that was published last year titled Metaphysical Emergence. So in that book, I talk about these two forms of emergence. One is weak and is kind of compatible with physicalism. So realization would be a case in point of weak emergence. And then the other is strong. And that's the one that, as I was saying before, I think is physicalism's best competitor. And basically, for weak emergent phenomena, the idea is that, for example, consciousness, a mental state, on a given occasion would have fewer powers than the physical state that realizes it. And for strong emergence, the idea is that strong emergence is incompatible with physicalism, because the idea is that, when the physical goings on get together and, into some kind of brain or whatever complex physical system, then something fundamentally novel comes into play that has a new causal power, fundamentally novel causal power. So those are my two schemas for emergence: weak and strong. One's compatible with physicalism, the other is not. And then for uh, complex systems, ordinary objects, consciousness, and free will, I consider for each of those phenomena whether what the case would be for it being weakly emergent or strongly emergent. And for the case of consciousness, I look to start at reasons for thinking it might be strongly emergent. So, as I was saying before, people have looked to the mind when they're, interested in these comprehensive theses about natural reality as a kind of, the hard case or the case that is really hardest for the physicalist to treat. And people like David Chalmers have suggested that the hard problem of consciousness is really where the action is, and that consciousness cannot really be given a satisfactory physicalist treatment. And the arguments that he offers and have often been offered in support of consciousness not being physically acceptable proceed by way of one or other explanatory gap argument. So the idea being that if you can conceive of a zombie, an entity that's physically and functionally just like me, for example, but without any consciousness, then that would indicate that something like strong emergence might be true, right? So you could have the physical goings on, but that isn't enough to get you consciousness. That's the basic idea. But I argue in my book that those arguments actually don't go through for a variety of reasons. So I think at present, that route to thinking that consciousness is strongly emergent, that kind of explanatory route doesn't establish the conclusion. So, in my view, whether consciousness is physically acceptable or not is ultimately an empirical matter. And I've even offered a kind of, in principle, implementable experiment that would, potentially establish whether or not consciousness was or was not, or whether or not consciousness was strongly emergent. That looks to existing criteria in the sciences for when we should posit a novel fundamental interaction. So I want to say, right now we're not in a position to perform these experiments, but if we could, the kind of experiment that would establish whether consciousness was strongly emergent or not would be one where you would, calculate the energy that was, or some other conserved quantity that would be associated with a kind of simple brain state, and then measure the energy or associated conserved quantity. And if there was a difference, you might want to say, okay, the right thing to say here is that there's a novel fundamental mental interaction. So right now, to be honest, I don't think we have a huge amount of empirical motivation for thinking that there are novel fundamental interactions at the level of mentality, but it's still a live possibility. So that's my view right now. It's an empirical matter. It's still an open question. Conceivability arguments don't establish that consciousness is fundamental or strongly emergent, and we'd have to do the requisite science at this point, I think, to figure it out.
Gotcha. And that actually is probably a really good segue into Master Uguay's question. Um, Master Uguay had quite a few questions for us, and we'll see what we can get to. Um,
Yeah.
but I think one of the big questions from Master Uguay was, what are the differences between philosophy of mind, neurology, psychology, all these different things, studying the brain, studying the mind, studying how we behave and act? What's the difference in regards to their goals and in regards to their methods?
Mm. Yeah, that's a deep question in a way. Methodology is one of the things that really interests me, and I do think that philosophy is distinctive methodologically from other disciplines, in particular the sciences. But I have a kind of integrationist view of philosophical and, in particular, metaphysical endeavor. I think that we're all kind of in this together, and we should be paying attention to each other's results and, trying to incorporate them into our own theorizing. So, with respect to, psychology, for example, there's actually different kinds of, psychological approaches. You might be thinking about, for example, uh, what are the underlying chemical bases for certain forms of uh, depression or some other kind of mental experience. You might also be, uh, psychologists thinking about how, different mental states are interacting with each other, how uh, things at a single kind of level of mentality, not paying any attention to what's going on at the level of the brain or chemistry or anything like that. So that's a different kind of psychological project. And I think both of those kinds of projects in psychology, the one that's kind of more associated with psychiatry and the one that's more associated with psychology of the sort, of associated with counseling or other kinds of investigations into um, uh, uh, systems of mental states, so to speak. Those are also important to philosophers of mind because that's data for us that we want to try to incorporate into our theorizing. So the previous, I think it was Ben had also asked about whether, you know, what were the prospects of mentality being computational. That's that's another area of investigation in AI and elsewhere, and I think um, another, uh, sort of neurosciences, broadly speaking. So, as a philosopher of mind, I want to be sensitive to those empirical uh, theories and practices as well, and try to you know uh, incorporate them to the extent possible into my own theorizing. So as I was just saying, to the extent that I think the ontological or metaphysical status of consciousness is ultimately an empirical matter of fact or an empirical question, that required that I look to the sciences, see what was their methodology for um, positing a novel fundamental interaction. So, just to sum up, I think as philosophers in general, we, in a way, you've probably heard this expression that philosophy is the queen of the sciences. I don't
Mhm.
know. Um, and there's a sense in which it's not that philosophy rules over the other disciplines, but rather that philosophy has to uh, has to attend to pretty much any relevant data wherever it may be, right? So in the other sciences, in philosophy of mind, what's going on in the neurosciences is especially important, but more generally, wherever the relevant considerations may be found, intuition or ordinary experience, physics, and so on, as philosophers, all of that is potentially relevant to our own theorizing. And I think with the other disciplines, that's just not quite so much the case, because in a way they're not trying to um, bring all data into their purview, right? The purview of their theorizing in the way that philosophers, especially when we're talking about these comprehensive theses about all of natural reality and how it all fits together, we're kind of obligated to try within our it's very hard, of course, but
Yeah.
to do what we can to attend to the full range of relevant data.
Yeah, and I think that's a fantastic answer.
Thanks.
Let me see here. Okay, this one's a bit of a curveball.
Okay.
And this is from Cool Dog, because we do have quite a few idealists here, and we're talking an awful lot about physicalism. Um, uh, why assume physicalism? And if it's false, where is that going to take us? Why are we so committed to studying this physical side of things?
Yeah, good. I think, uh, well, first of all, I just want to say I'm actually on record not being a physicalist. um, Personally, because in the last chapter of my book, when I address free will, I think there's a case to be made that free will that's really the hard problem, not consciousness, but free will. I think you can get a case going for free will being strongly emergent. So in that case, um, I'm sort of committed to, not being physicalist, at least as regards free will. Um, Idealism, I think, is actually a really interesting view. I'm fascinated by, in fact, I just finished teaching a course on Berkeley. So I don't want to say that that view is in any way not to be attended to or it's not important. It might even be true. I mean, there's a lot of, you know, um, Berkeley, among others, idealists have offered some really super interesting motivations for their view. One of my favorite one is that, if, um, for example, on Berkeley's view, a table is just a collection of ideas, right? Or good question, whose ideas,
Mhm.
ultimately ideas in God's mind or something like that. But if reality is constituted by ideas, then there's no room for skepticism to enter in, right? So skepticism about the external world enters in when there's a kind of gap between representation and reality. But if, representation and reality coincide, that's it. What you see is what you get. And Berkeley was very explicit that he thought this was an advantage. Idealism that it evaded those kinds of concerns that are associated with Cartesian skepticism about the external world and so on. So it's a great view. It's very interesting, and I think as a metaphysician I said earlier, I'm interested in methodology. I'm interested in you know uh, trying to articulate resources for metaphysical theorizing. For example, the notion of what's fundamental and what metaphysically depends on what and so on, that will make room for an appropriately wide range of views. And I don't want to rule out uh, antecedently views like idealism or anything else. So just to be clear, I'm uh, certainly not I don't mean to imply that physicalism or even strong emergentism are the only kind of interesting views. My focus on those views in particular has primarily been, arising out of my initial interest in physics and natural reality and the sciences and so on, and how they fit together. So it's kind of motivated by, um, uh, I guess it was kind of a contingent trajectory in my own academic and life and the things that I found interesting and so on, which kind of led me to think about, well, suppose you did think that the fundamental physical goings on were driving the train, so to speak. How would you understand? What about macro reality? Does it get to exist in its own right? Um, is there more than one level? Is there a kind of structure to natural reality, or could it even be that there were some fundamental goings on that occur at the macro level and stuff like that? So those problems uh, exercised me, not because I'm not interested in these other views, but just because they kind of naturally grew out of a focus on the natural sciences.
So this is fantastic because we just had Chad pop off with a series of free will questions for you.
Oh, good.
Um, so uh, in regarding free will, um, there's a number of different arguments for and against, and you talked about free will as kind of this hard problem, the true hard problem, maybe, right? And with these numbers and different perspectives, we have maybe something like Helen Stewart's view, Peter Van Inwagen's. We have maybe something like what Frankfurt would offer, with more of that compatibilist notion. There's different schools of compatibilism. Is there a place
Right.
that you think is maybe more strongly motivated than some other places in this debate, and why is that? Why would that be your position?
Well, I think that, you can make sense of the compatibilist position, but I just registering my own sort of introspective, uh, um, uh, findings. Speaking of methodology, Barclay was always like, you should introspect, with respect to these questions of mind and so on, self and subject, and dot dot dot. I think introspective access to our mental states plays a very powerful role in these debates about consciousness and so on. And I think they also play a very important role in the debates over the status of free will. And so I think it's actually pretty common, even among compatibilists, to register that, yeah, we seem from the inside, we seem to have genuine libertarian variety free will of the sort that's not just, things are really so complex and uh, physical goings on, are really, in a sense, leading us to do certain things, but in a kind of complex, interesting way. That's all fine and well, but I feel like when I, hold the piece of chalk and I just want to, I say, okay, I'm going to exercise my free will right now. Am I going to throw it up in the air or not? And then I just decide. I make a choice and I do that thing. I feel like our introspective sense of genuine free will of the sort that is transcendent, as the way I put it, I say it's nomologically transcendent. Even if there were, it's not a matter of any kind of law governed goings on, including merely probabilistic quantum, like quantum goings on. So
Mhm.
it's just not at all. It seems to me it's not at all law governed. And so introspectively, I and many others, including many compatibilists, are happy to allow that we have we seem to have genuine libertarian free will. But then the compatibilists and others are, motivated for one or other reason to reject those seeming appearances of libertarian free will on grounds of one or other consideration. Maybe the most common one recently is these kind of libet experiments, which seem to indicate that decisions to do this or that were in fact subsequent conscious decisions to do some, make some finger motion or something like that, were subsequent to certain kinds of brain activity in a way that Libet and some others interpreted as indicating that the choice was, in a sense, downstream of a kind of, unconscious brain process. In which case, you sort of retrospectively think you made a choice to do this thing, a genuine choice, but in fact, it's just like almost a reflex action. So the form of the argument there would be something like, okay, you may seem to have free will, but empirical science has shown that you don't really. So
Right.
as the next best option, here's a one or other compatibilist view for you, or you might even go eliminativist,
Mhm.
or hard determinist or something like that. But I think that it's possible to push back on the interpretations of the Libet experiment. So that's what I do in that last chapter of my book. Is I kind of look at um, you know, the motivations for the interpretations that are given, and I find that there are alternative interpretations that are compatible with the appearances being genuine. Um, yeah.
Okay.
Was
Uh,
that Does that answer the question?
I think so. I think, like,
Mhm.
right now, my brain is just absorbing a lot, and
Okay.
I'm just taking it all in, um so I think, depending on how you are for
Oh,
time, I think maybe, like, I don't know if you could do 1 or 2 more questions?
I can do one or two more questions, but let me just close up that
Sure.
previous question just by saying kind of the form of the argument that I give at the end of that book is actually very straightforward. It's sort of like, we seem to have libertarian free will, right? To put it more neutrally, we seem to have nomologically transcendent free will, right? And then
Mhm.
there's another premise which I didn't discuss yet, but it's something like, if you have, some kind of this kind of introspective access or really good, seeming reason to think that you, in this case, have this kind of there's that phenomenon, then you're justified in believing that it is genuine unless somebody gives you good reason to think that you can't take it as genuine, right? And then, you know, the 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 third premise is going to be something like we don't have any good reason to think that we can't take it as genuine, right? Namely, and that's where the action is in trying to push back against those experiments and their supposed results. And then the conclusion is that we actually, we are justified in believing that we have nomologically transcendent free will.
Makes sense to me, I mean, I like it. Um,
Yeah,
um, so yeah, I guess I'm gonna go to, uh, Ghost of Kiev's question. Is it Kiev or Kiev? I guess that one's topical. Um,
yeah.
so he's kind of asking about, mind-body dualism, so these maybe, like, substance dualist accounts, kind of like Descartes, what have you. Um,
Hmm.
uh it seems like, you've answered the first part of this question, which is, like, is it the case that the naturalistic stance, assumes something not proven yet? It seems like it's still an open question.
Hmm.
Um, but in regards to that, is there still that possibility that, hey, what we are, what our minds are, is just these electrical impulses in our brain, um, and
Hmm.
these biochemical reactions, is that option of, maybe no real emergence at all, or the weakest possible, the weak emergence, or those options maybe still on the table?
Um, yeah, I guess I would have to say that. Well, let me see. First of all, let's just put aside free will, right? For if so at present anyway, I think we have independent reason to think that free will is emergent in some or other sense, right? Perhaps even strongly emergent. But for other sorts of mental states, this now goes back to consciousness, for example, or other kinds of qualitative mental states. Even though I have argued that existing reasons to think that those are strongly emergent don't go through, I do also argue that they are they're at least weakly emergent. Okay. So uh, the considerations that I give are, they tend to appeal to considerations such as multiple realizability, where the idea is that you could have a single mental state that is realized by many different brain states or ultimately fundamental physical states. And on the proper understanding of in what realization consists, it's not going to turn out to be viable to think that um, you could offer a kind of identity based reduction of that multiple realizability. Okay, so um, if that's right, then that would rule out the idea that there was uh, no, not even weak emergence of those phenomena. But there's the debate is ongoing on that. So I guess maybe I will say in a qualified way, um, there's room for the reductionist to push back against some of the things I say. A lot of the debate I have too with reductionists, in service of trying to argue that this or that phenomenon is weakly emergent, at least weakly emergent, um, is predicated on a certain methodological principle that the reductionists, to be frank, needn't accept. Namely, that we should try to preserve the appearances of macro level distinctness and causal, autonomy. Um, I am, I try to be explicit about my own methodological inclinations. You know, that to me, preserving the appearances is very, in my, I take that to be an important theoretical desiderata. Um,
Yeah.
However, a reductionist may be motivated by, um, considerations that while they don't loom so large in my own theorizing, they loom large in their theorizing. And there, for example, ontological parsimony is something that, you know, plays a big role. So I think given our present, um, the methodological divergence that one does find in philosophy, and not only philosophy, but really every area of human endeavor, including the sciences. These kinds of methodological inclinations can make a difference in what kinds of theories you find optimal for purposes of understanding this or that phenomenon. And as a consequence, it's kind of hard, I think, at the end of the day for example, a non-reductionist about, let's say, you know, pain states to uh, convince a reductionist about pain states that, they're wrong. I think uh, what the best that one can do under those circumstances is say, look, here's what I take to be important. I think this is a systematic, natural view. It makes sense of our, seeming to be autonomous creatures, and not when I see something that's red or I feel some pain, I don't have any kind of perceptual or other direct access to the microphysical goings on. It seems like there's higher levels that are comparatively abstract, causally and ontologically, as
Mhm.
opposed to the lower level physical goings on. And I find that important to take those appearances into a question. So if I can do so in a systematic, non-kludgy way, that seems great for me. Now the reductionist can just say, yeah, but you could still say this or that reductionist thing. So there, at the end of the day, I just want to say my primary goal is to stay on my own horse as opposed to knock them off their horse. So um, I would not say that the arguments in my book are such that they kill reductionism. Reductionism remains a live option for those people who want to really insist on certain uh, certain methodological desiderata, for example, ontological parsimony and so on.
That makes sense. And I mean, and we can leave the rest of that problem for another day. Maybe someone takes Hempel and wants to knock some reductionists off their horse. I don't know. But
Okay, exactly.
um, um, yeah, I think our last question here, and then we'll close with any social media links. Actually, the book that you put out or that you've been discussing, if we could get an idea of where that's sold after this, that would be great. Um, because there's some interest. Ben, after you answered his question, said he's 100% going to buy that book, and that
Awesome.
you had him at hello. So, um,
Okay, great.
um, so we got a question from Dave here. Dave's one of our uh, philosophy of religion guys, fantastic PhD candidate.
Great.
And one of his questions is kind of looking at a lot of your work dealing with fundamentality, dealing with these explanatory forces from religion and metaphysics in mind, this journey that
Mhm.
you've taken. Um, it does seem a bit Western. And
Mm.
the question is there anything maybe from the Eastern schools, Eastern religion, Eastern film mind, that we can bring in maybe to help improve or build up the Western kind of side of the school?
Yeah, thanks. That's a fantastic point, and, I've been teaching for the last few years a non-Western metaphysics course, and, I, have focused specifically on Indian and Chinese, Buddhism, and, there's various schools, um, of both. So, as far as mentality goes, I do think, or just, sorry, more generally, um, metaphysics goes, I think it's very important to attend to the non-Western traditions historically, as well as contemporary traditions, to know what the options are and to, as I was saying earlier, be appropriately ecumenical when we are in our theorizing. So, for example, accounts of fundamentality that uh, that assert or maintain that what it is for a given entity to be fundamental is for it not to metaphysically depend on anything else, not to metaphysically depend on anything. So this kind of idea, sort of the fundamental goings on of like atoms, completely self-sufficient, not at all kind of interacting with anything else, you know, with respect to their natures.
Mm.
If you see in the non-Western traditions, you see, for example, in Huayan Buddhism, a completely different vision of fundamental reality as massively interconnected in such a way that everything metaphysically depends on everything else. And I think that's it's a very beautiful vision, and it's one that seems to me to be coherent, and it's one that our conception of fundamentality in metaphysics should make room for. So it was really as a result of my encounter with sort of non-Western traditions that kind of solidified my own position that we should not understand fundamentality as involving just independence in this way, right? And have we need a better account of fundamentality, one that would make room for these kind of interesting non-atomistic conceptions of fundamental reality.
Lovely. So yeah, so with that said, uh, if you can give us your book title one more time and let us know where we can get it.
Yeah, it's the title is Metaphysical Emergence and not Metaphysical Emergency. Whenever I go, it's it's an Oxford University Press book, and when I went to Amazon just to see if you know it was up there and if anyone had been purchasing it. And so it immediately changed the title to Metaphysical Emergency, and my book didn't come up. I was like, "Hey, maybe my book does constitute a metaphysical emergency, but that's another issue."
All right. I think I found the link. I'm gonna post it in the chat. Boom. Oh, Stone got it
Yeah,
too. Excellent.
that's
Um,
great.
but yeah, I'll tell you
And
what, Professor. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
I just wanted to say that the book is pretty dang expensive, and if anyone is really very interested in reading the book and they can't afford it, just email me and I'll send you a PDF proof. But don't tell anyone I said that.
Ooh. All right. Exclusive
Hmm.
access. You heard it. You heard it here first. Um, we'll mute that part for the publish.
Thanks.
Um, giving Stone more work to do. Love it. But yeah, so we'll have an after party. There's a lot of ideas here to discuss. A lot of questions answered here, guys. Professor Wilson, thank you so much for taking the time out of your day for
Well,
us here.
thank you. Those were excellent questions. Really appreciate the conversation. Thanks for having me on.
All right. And then with that said, we'll be closing down the stage. So if you guys want to stick around, go ahead and just jump into Sirius Saloon and we'll pick up with a little bit of an after party. All right.
Cool.
Good night, everyone.
Enjoy.